Hi there YouTube, this is extremewirehead for another Cardfight Vanguard clan intro where I look at the beginners and try to give them an idea about what each clan is capable of, what their strengths and weaknesses are, and how you should be thinking about the clan in terms of playing it and when you're up against it. In this video, I want to look at Nova Grappler. Nova Grappler is canonically a beginner's clan. It is a clan based around a bunch of space wrestlers. At least that's my understanding of it. And they really run on a very simple system. When attacks go off, things stand up and then they attack some more. But unlike many of the other clans that you've seen thus far, this clan tends to use up all of its resources very quickly. Because it uses up these resources so quickly, they tend to die out during the end game. So you're going to have to be watchful of this, and you have to play it in a rather tempo game to try and keep up and hopefully close out the game through the mid game. In any case, that's a simple introduction to Nova Grappler and how they think, but let's get down to the cards. So the first card that I want to look at is Asura Kaiser Vic 10 from the G4. Asura Kaiser's skill is when this unit's attack hits the Vanguard, you may choose one of your rear guards, stand it, and gets 5k. Nova Grappler has this very strange effect where when things attack, other things stand up, and then you go through the cycles of the multiple attacks, but they tend to do this in a rather expensive way. If you notice, it requires quite heavily the fact that there are rear guards, so it is a clan that cannot get away from the fact that you have to play something on the rear guard. In that sense, they are susceptible to clans that attack in that sense, but they are very strong if left to their own devices. That's the only G4 I want to look at. It's not too complicated, and it shows off how Nova Grappler's idea conceptually first started. Let's go look at a G3, and of course we're going to be looking at the Strider of the clan, Extreme Battler Viktor, and you know he's extreme because he's got 2 X's. When this unit's attack hits a Vanguard, this unit gets 5,000 until end of that battle. Choose one of your rear guards and stand it. It gets 5,000 until end of turn. His freestanding ability is a rarity in Nova Grappler, and that alone kind of makes him worth it. But you're never going to see it because you're going to be using his second skill, which is when you stride. Your Vanguard gets the skill. When it attacks, you may pay the cost of Counterblast 1. If you do, choose one of your rear guards and stand it. If you do so, stand it and it gets 5,000. This ability cannot be used for the rest of the turn. This means that it is in this awkward place. A lot of the strides tend to use their counterblast at the stride phase. This is very expensive, and it means you have to plan out your attack early on and how it goes about during the turn order. In the case of Viktor, it means that you can give them the skill, choose not to activate it if you are attacked by, let's say, Root Flare or other defensive cards. And in that way, you can control the amount of resources you spend while still having the skill open to you if you need it. Because of this, Viktor is a high-class card that a lot of people use, and it does teach you a lot about the planning strategy that is open to Nova Grappler in general. Going down to the next G3, I want to look at a really old card called Asura Kaiser. Asura Kaiser is one of the original bosses of Nova Grappler, and his basic skill is if you reveal a grade 3 Nova Grappler during their drive check, choose a rear guard and stand it. Very simple, nothing complicated, but I think it showcases very simply Nova Grappler's problem. They either have very high costed skills for what they're doing, and very expensive actually, or they have very unconventional ways of activating it. Because of the unconventional nature of Asura Kaiser and his samurai support, they aren't really used that much. Death Army in particular comes to mind. Nova Grappler is full of old sub-clans that didn't work out because they were costed around skills that were very awkward to use and highly irregular. It wasn't a system that you could plan out for, and in that sense, they really couldn't keep up. The last G3 I'm looking at is Gold Rutile. Gold Rutile is here just because I wanted a card to put this all together. If you want to start your own deck and try out Nova Grappler as a clan, I highly recommend you look at the trial deck with Gold Rutile on the cover. You'll know instantly because he's wielding that weird katana. When your rearguard's attack hits the Vanguard, choose a card from your damage zone and turn it face up. Counterblast 2. When this unit's attack hits the Vanguard, you may pay the cost. If you do, choose a rearguard and stand it. As you can see, his second skill is incredibly expensive and very inefficient, but his first skill works even with any rearguard that hits, as long as it hits the Vanguard. In that case, it kind of becomes a situation where you can make a deck that's full of very heavy costing, while keeping it open that because the rear guards keep hitting, you can actually fund these costs with the refunds given by gold Ruta. In that sense, it's a decent card. It's not that great, especially in the era of Stride where you're not going to be seeing the Vanguard skill very often, but it's still something to watch out for because gold Ruta in particular is a very good card when you're trying to learn, and especially if you don't bother striding. That's the last of the G3 I wanted to look at. Gold Ruta in particular is good for beginners, but all of these are rather simple and easy to learn choices if you are getting into the clan. Going down to the G2, we're going to be looking at a couple of odd choices, I would think. The first one is something that has created a lot of what became Nova Grappler's later strategies, how they've evolved over the years, and where they stand now. It is maybe the originator of this style, but in many cases, this is the card that really created the formula that a lot of other cards followed, so I'm going to show the original. You can do your own research about all the other versions. Beast Deity, Golden Anklet. Because they have a lot of cards that stand other rear guards and they require other rear guards, sometimes it is nice to have a card that just works by itself. During your battle phase, when this unit becomes standard, this unit gets 3000 power until end of turn. A lot of other cards have +4, +5, other amounts, maybe some other effects, added retires, and the like. But in general, Nova Grappler had this thing where it was very expensive because just standing it was an extra attack, and an extra attack should be costed appropriately. In this era of Stride, a single attack doesn't mean as much, and because of that, they had to add additional effects on top of the stand to make it worthwhile. And this stand in particular means that every time you have a rear guard that stands, this one in particular, you can get power, do an additional attack, make it stand again, get additional power, and those abilities stack on top of each other, making for each attack as the battle phase goes on even more dangerous. In many ways, this is the card that really showcased how Nova Grappler was slowly evolving into how other clans were doing it at the time, and because of that, it is notable and something you're going to have to watch out for. Cards of this style, of this kind, are the cards you're going to be looking at, especially when starting out the game. The next card I want to look at is a really old card that you might not even know of unless you've played the game since maybe the very start. Brutal Jack. Brutal Jack is a restraint unit, in other words, it can't attack, but by paying the cost of Counterblast 1, it loses the restraint. Now, this is normally a very expensive thing, but because he's an 11k for a G2, it is somewhat okay. If he is boosted, he's a 16k, which makes him an incredibly dangerous unit, but this only happens when he's on Vanguard. It's a very expensive card, but it is great on the defensive. Because of all of these combos, it is still a somewhat decent card even to this day because it stops a lot of rushes, stops a lot of incoming plays, and makes a robust team. Now, is it really worth the Counterblast 1 for all of these defensive abilities? Maybe not. But it is still decent to see how Nova Grappler started out. They were very expensive on costing, and I'm going to show you a couple of cards later on why they can be so. But you have to understand that they started from a place of expensive costs for simple skills, and that made them not that great until later on when Viktor showed up. The last G2 I'm going to look at is a very interesting card because of how it interacts with the game. In terms of the battle phase and how the back and forth of Vanguard goes, you tend to lose cards every time you get an attack. Either you lose cards in the damage zone, or you lose cards from hand guarding. In general, a single attack is worth about 1 card. A single rearguard attack anyway. Street Bouncer puts this on its head. Rest this unit, choose another one of your rear guards in the same column as this unit and rest it. When this unit is placed on R, if you have a Nova Grappler Vanguard, you may pay the cost. If you do, draw a card. Street Bouncer skill effectively does exactly the same thing. But instead of attacking the opponent for a single attack, you draw a card. In this zero-sum situation, you are essentially doing exactly the same thing. There's nothing very different about this combo. The difference being that Street Bouncer adds to your ability rather than taking away from the opponent's, and that's a very big difference. In a card game where there's only 50 cards, having an extra draw can mean the difference between winning and losing, and Street Bouncer gives you that option. You don't have to use his skill. You can still use a normal attack, but it is a very nice thing to have this option. Because of the utility and greatness of Street Bouncer, he was dropped down to an 8k, which I think is a bit harsh, but he is still a rather decent card to look into, especially when first learning the game. Sometimes just having more choices means that a beginner can understand how to operate and how to give a little spin to the way that they think. Street Bouncer gives you those options. I teased it a little bit, but let's go down to the G1 Claydol Mechanic. Part of the reason anyway that Nova Grappler had these problems with costing and how to get about all of these high costs is because they are one of the easiest clans to actually unflip their damage zone. Counterblast is very cheap when it comes to the Nova Grapplers. They can actually remove and reuse a lot of their counterblast. It is a very simple thing with cards such as this and other ones, making it very easy to redo those skills. The problem is it takes an additional turn, and because of that additional turn, they're usually 2 turns too late and end up dead before they can pull this strange combo off. That's the reason, but it is still notable that Claydol Mechanic and other cards are sometimes used in a meta where they need speed and they need to use their counterblast all in one turn. Still a decent card, maybe not great, but it is notable that this is the clan that started this style of card. One of the last cards we're going to look at is the G0 Riot Horn. Riot Horn's skill is very simple. When a beast deity in the same lane as this unit stands, you may stand this unit. I mentioned about cards that like to give effects when it stands itself. This card actually benefits from cards standing in the same lane, meaning that you can have combos that revolve around standing the front and then the back follows because of Riot Horn. These combos do show up in some of the others, such as the Extreme Battlers and whatever else that they come out in the future. But it's important to note that standing is the very essence of Nova Grappler. They will want to restand the rear guards and make effects go off. Watch out for that and try to kill off cards such as this and their many constituents in the other subclans to make sure that you don't have a bad time. And lastly, we can't go about talking about Nova Grappler, of all people, without talking about the biggest card that really shook the meta back when Legion was first a thing. Cat Butler. Cat Butler's skill is at the end of the attack that your Vanguard attacked. If it did not hit, you may discard this G0. If you do, choose a grade 2 or less Nova Grappler Vanguard and stand it. Very strange skill. Retiring your own units is not a common thing with a Nova Grappler. I would say this is the only card that does it. But it does offer something very, very unique. It allows you to stand the Vanguard at the cost of a single card. How is this basically fair? You have the requirement that it has to be a G2 or less, meaning no twin drives. This was obviously offset by the fact that when Legion came out and you were able to stand the G2, the G3 actually followed. Because of this combo, you did have very crazy plays. Even to this day, you could run G2 rushes that actually use this to create additional power lanes and then retiring it for an additional attack. It is especially useful for cards such as the Brutal Jack that I mentioned earlier, comboing into multiple 16k attacks, which is incredibly devastating. And all of this comes together to create a card that is in a strange place. In certain matchups and certain metas, it is a very, very powerful, maybe even overpowered card. But in today's standards, it doesn't see any play because it requires a G2. Very strange card, but it is notable for that reason. I am proud to say that this card is still something you can get on the cheap, I think, and still something you should look into when you're learning the clan and don't have enough cards. And I think that's it. Nova Grappler is an interesting clan. They have a lot of pieces that make a lot of great plays, but a lot of these plays involve using up all of your resources way too quickly. Because of this, the early game, they are very, very strong. The mid game, they are especially brutal, but they peter out at the end of the game. They can't really keep up. In that sense, you tend to play this very similarly to some of the other tempo games and run the clan very similar to a couple of choices where they are mostly a glass cannon. The early game is mostly setting up, trying to get as many cards into your hand as possible, and then you rush them down with all of the cards in your hand and hope for the best. That's really just what Nova Grappler becomes. The ability to not rush and hold on to some cards is going to be the defining characteristic, and a good player will know how much to push and how much to hold back to make sure that they stay alive in a defensive game. In many ways, they are not a competitive clan. Viktor is a great card, but he doesn't really have a side boss that really works well. A lot of the support does work, but I think it works much better for the G2 and the Legion decks rather than the overcosted G4s. They do have great strides, but they have difficulty maintaining a large number of great strides because a lot of them cost way too much. Outside of the G4 Viktor, they have many problems with costing, and because of this, they can't really use too many of them. You will see a lot of them actually skimp out on the more expensive choices to use the cheaper ones just because they are more likely to be used. A toolbox stride is sometimes more beneficial than a stride that's good as a finisher. When going up against them, you should watch out for the first 10 turns. After you get past the first 10 turns, if they haven't rushed you already, you've probably won. In many ways, they are very easy to spot because they need to get to about, I would say, 8 to 10 cards before they rush down their game. And if they do pull out the restand, they probably don't have the hand to maintain themselves. Anyway, this has been Extreme Wirehead. I hope that helped you. This is a rather cheap clan to get into, but Nova Grappler is still a somewhat decent clan if you're trying to get into the game. Rather cheap, very simple, has a great mechanic, but requires so much about your rear guards that you're gonna cry when you see some of the other defensive clans. In any case, this has been it, and I'll see you next time.